Hey, I'd like to welcome you to Central Online. So excited that you're able to be watching and join us in this series that we've titled Relationship Goals. You know, there's a lot of crazy relationship goals out there that people have, and they just seem like they're all over the place. But for us as Christians, we want to have different relationship goals. You know, our relationship goals aren't about cuddling up on the couch and feeding each other popcorn. You know, our relationship goals are about things that bring glory and honor to God. And so in the first week of our series, we kind of laid the foundation for a relationship goal. The relationship goal that we should have and we should be seeking above all else is that we seek God first. We seek God first in our marriage. We seek God first in our own life. In any relationship we have, that is our goal, is that we seek God first. And then last week we built off of that. And we looked at the relationship goal of a covenant versus a contract or a casual marriage relationship. And we talked about how we want it to be we, not just me. And we kind of looked at God's math, that it's not a half plus a half equals one. And that's how a lot of people approach a relationship, is I'm in as far as you're in. It's not that. We looked at that it's not even 1 plus 1 equals 1. It's 1 plus 1 plus 1. You, your spouse, and God, all in, all fully committed, unconditionally to one another, and that equals 1. A husband leaves his mother and father to be united to his wife as one flesh. And so we talked about that last week. This week, we have another relationship goal, but this one is kind of a two-parter. We've talked a lot about stuff for married people, and certainly there's applications for single people, but this week it's a little different. All right, so this week I'm going to start with the single people. All right, single people or people who are dating, people who are not yet married. And so if you're married, what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to fast forward to the second part of this, because the second part we're going to be addressing married people specifically. So if you're not married, don't think, oh, I get to check out. No, think of this as an opportunity to take what you've learned, what you've experienced, and apply it and filter it through this lens and be a mentor. Be in a spot to help single people out, whether it's your own kids or your friends or grandkids or people you work with. This is an opportunity to take some of what you've learned and experienced over the years and apply it to, pouring into other people. So, for our single people, I'm just going to start right off the bat. Our single people, your relationship goal is to date intentionally. Date intentionally. Don't approach a relationship with this sort of casual, whatever, blah, 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 just kind of figure it out as I go. No, if you're dating, you should be dating for a purpose, an intentional purpose. And again, this goes back to our goals. What are we aiming for? What are we shooting for? Hopefully, by now, you've built this foundation of seeking God first and establishing a covenant-type relationship. And so, if you're not yet married and you're dating, approach a dating relationship with an intentional purpose. I remember as a kid, one of the first times I sort of saw or heard of a relationship progression. I was at Wigan Street Playground. I was in elementary school. I was probably in first grade, maybe kindergarten. I don't remember. But I remember for the very first time hearing a relationship progression. It went something like this. Andy and so-and-so sitting in a tree. Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes Andy pushing a baby carriage. I remember hearing that sitting on a seesaw. I was sitting on a seesaw right as you came down the steps to the Wigan Street Playground. I was on a seesaw with a girl, right? She was on the other end, I was on the other end. And they told me, if you're on a seesaw with a girl, that means you want to marry her. I was like, whatever. And then some of my friends came over and they all started chanting this. Andy and so-and-so sitting in a tree. I'm not going to say who the so-and-so is, but I remember thinking, I'm not ready to get married. Are you kidding me? I'm not ready for this. It freaked me out. And then the idea of me pushing a baby carriage, was like, No, like I'm not ready for this level of commitment. And unfortunately for a lot of people, we've kind of built our idea of what a relationship progression should look like, what commitment should look like off of little rhymes, little sayings like that. And we think that's the order it goes. And so right at the end of this message, I want to show you though, that that's really not the progression. Sitting in a tree, K-I-S-S-I-N-G, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes so-and-so pushing a baby carriage. I want to show you how sometimes we have that really twisted. But I've been reading this book titled The Family. So it's simply called The Family. It's a Christian perspective on the contemporary home. And let me tell you, it's basically a textbook, but there's some really interesting stuff in there. One of the things I didn't realize is some of the misconceptions that we currently have about dating. And did you understand that dating is relatively new? Yeah, dating is a relatively new thing. In the past, throughout history, mate selection, which that's what they call it in that book. They don't call it dating, they call it mate selection, or a mate selection process, to just tell you how dry of a read that can be. But very interesting concepts in there. They said mate selection was typically chosen by the parents, and it was typically done based on factors like age, experience, cultural heritage, and wealth, family wealth. And parents typically made decisions for who their children were going to marry based on those things. Think of the old school bride price system or the dowry system you're probably familiar with. In the past, brides were simply seen as property to be exchanged or an enticement of valuable labor added to another home. The groom's family would give goods to the bride's family in exchange for the bride, with the assumption the bride would bring something into the marriage of having more children and also valuable labor. Honestly, you read that, you hear about that, and you're like, that's pretty messed up. You look at marriage throughout the years, and it's like we think, oh, marriage, the institution is really struggling now. Honestly, there's not always been a super healthy view of what marriage is and isn't. And so as a society, in some ways we've grown, haven't we? We've challenged this traditional approach to marriages. Old school marriages really were more like a transaction or a link between extended families. And commitment was typically not as much to the spouse as it was to the contract that was made with the extended families. A bride or a groom couldn't really reject some of that because it affected so many of the extended families in the community. And so it wasn't really a covenant that was made, was it? It was almost by definition a contract. So again, not super healthy. So we look back at all these marriages, not all of them, but throughout history, that's kind of the precedent that has been set. And then in the postmodern world, the world we're living in now, we don't have parent-arranged marriages. And sometimes we think, well, maybe we should try that again, but we don't have them anymore. But what we have is still sometimes just as damaging. As people are trying to choose their mate, the person they're going to marry, the person they're going to spend the rest of their life with, based solely on this idea of romantic love. Right? I need to feel ushy-gushy. I need to watch all these movies and just get those feelings. The music, those love songs just need to make the perfect sense. Not whenever I'm with that person. And the magazines, the magazines and the 10 checklists of types of love. And they all glorify romantic love. And so in our culture, we have had this huge push away from arranged marriages. Away from those obvious contract type marriages, which I believe are wrong. And now, instead though, we have marriages that are all based solely on this idea of romantic love, which let me tell you is fleeting, right? There's waves, there's ups and downs in life. Romantic love is the biggie that most people are searching for. It's that gushy, sappy, just lovey-dovey, puppy eye type feeling. And what happens is you might be able to find that at first, but it's sort of like baking a cake. You ever bake something? Over quarantine, Joe and I were experimenting baking all sorts of stuff. And, You got to pay really close attention to the details. We were making some banana bars. Some of our bananas had go bad, and we're like, hey, let's make banana bars, and let's make this cream cheese icing on top of it. We used the wrong type of sugar. Evidently, XX sugar, I think is what it was, doesn't mean just regular sugar. It means powdered sugar. Why in the world we decided XX equals powdered? I don't know. I'm not a baker, I'm a preacher. But anyways, that was the case. So we added regular sugar instead of powdered sugar. And we made these banana bars, we put that icing on there, and the icing was so gritty and so sweet that it ruined the entire thing, right? We had made these, I mean, the banana bars were pretty good, but the icing, just because we added the wrong ingredient, and it was even close, right? It was a type of sugar, it was just the wrong type of sugar. Ruined the whole thing. And a marriage built on the idea solely of romantic love will probably ruin the whole thing. Don't get me wrong, romantic love can and should be a part of it. But it needs to be a different type of love that this marriage is built on. In dating, without an understanding of this, dating without an intentional goal, an intentional purpose, is kind of like that. It's kind of like baking like that. It may feel right, it may look right, and people may be like, wow, that looks really good. But if the ingredients are off, it's not good. It's not what you want it to be, even if it may look the part for a little bit. Honestly, the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about dating. Isn't that kind of weird to think about? You know, the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about dating because dating is relatively new. Dating is not anti-biblical. So in some ways, the Bible doesn't say a lot about dating, but the Bible says a lot about relationships and boundaries and expectations. And it doesn't come out and give a directive on it like it does with marriages, but it does give us a lot of wisdom, a lot of ways to approach it if we use context clues. Right, if we look at, hey, here's the marriage, here's the right ingredients that are supposed to go into a marriage. So when you're dating, you should be looking and assembling these ingredients that all make a healthy marriage, if that makes sense. We know where we want to be headed. A covenant relationship with unconditional commitment where a couple seeks God first. So if that is where you're at, if you're in the world of dating, maybe you're in high school, maybe you're out of high school, maybe you're older, and you're in a healthy spot to start dating, you're going to date with intentionality. Thinking of a verse like this, 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And that includes dating. So, we understand we need to intentionally date. We need to assemble the right ingredients because we know what we want. We want a covenant marriage with unconditional commitment that we strive to seek God first. But how? How do you intentionally date? Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart. Dating, people who are dating seem to think it's the norm that, hey, you're going to get your heart trampled on. You're going to get your heart chewed up and spit out, and you just got to take it. You just got to embrace it. That's just part of it. Well, I'm here to tell you that doesn't have to go with it. And this is my first kind of how do you intentionally date for people who are dating, getting ready to date, or currently dating. You establish boundaries. Establish boundaries that bring glory to God. Protect your heart. Guard your heart. Guarding your heart is talking about the stuff you allow into your heart, like I think media, social media, culture, but also the people that you allow into your heart. So establish boundaries that bring glory and honor to God. And if you can do that, do it before you're in a relationship. Oftentimes, if you wait till you're in the relationship, those boundaries, it's really hard to establish them and set them in place then. Do it before you start dating. Do it before you're in the relationship. Specifically when it comes to physical temptations, lust, if you're going to wait till you're in the moment to figure out what your boundaries are physically, you've waited too long. It's going to be way, way too challenging to overcome that. So what I encourage people to do, whether I'm counseling people who've been married for 30 years or teenagers, is be specific with your boundaries. Write them down. Share them with someone you trust, right? Someone who will give you honest feedback. Someone who will say, these boundaries are terrible. These are nothing. Or someone who will say, these boundaries aren't realistic. Or someone who will say, how are you going to follow through with these boundaries? But share them with someone. Write them down. Be specific. If you don't establish boundaries, if you're like, oh, I'm not going to do that, then you might as well not have any boundaries. Because you're just going to let your feelings lead you. And our feelings, guys, our feelings lie to us. Our feelings lead us astray. Feelings will take over as your flesh takes over. And pretty soon, any thought you had of boundaries is blown away. So, if you're listening to this and you're not dating, you're married or whatever the situation, if you're a parent and you have teenagers that are dating, ask your teenagers, what are your boundaries? What are your boundaries in dating, in this relationship? If you have a young married couple in your life, ask them, what are your boundaries? What were the boundaries you set up? What were some you wish you had set up? Ask. If you have friends, ask. If you're trying to establish your own, ask other people what their boundaries are. Establish them, get feedback, and share them with the person you're thinking about entering a dating relationship with. Think about that. If you want to intentionally date, establish boundaries, then be right up front. Hey, here's the terms, right? Here's my boundaries. Can you respect these? Can you respect these boundaries? And if they don't support your boundaries, or they know your boundaries and they're constantly trying to push past your boundaries, that should be a pretty good indication of where your future should lie with them. So you can intentionally date by establishing boundaries. And the second thing for our dating couples is this: intentionally date by dating someone going the same direction as you. Date someone going the same direction of you. I always think of the phrase, don't be unequally yoked. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, it says, don't be yoked together. Don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? Don't be with the wrong person because it's easy in the moment. Because the closer you get and you become yoked with that person, it's not going to be easy. It's not worth it in the long run. Think more about the right here and now. And who are you joining your life as one with? Think about that. If you choose to be unequally yoked, you will live a life where you are constantly being pulled one direction and they are constantly going the opposite direction. Being yoked was a term they used for farm animals, specifically oxen back in the day. There was this wooden beam they would place over the neck of two oxen. And you wouldn't put an incredibly strong oxen next to a weak oxen. And especially what you wouldn't do is put a yoke around an oxen and a donkey. Or put a yoke around an oxen and a horse. Because it just wouldn't work. You would never achieve the goal of plowing a straight line. You would be all over the place. And what would end up happening is you'd end up straining one, overworking one, and then damaging the other. One would do the brunt of the work, and the other one is fighting and resisting and ultimately going to get hurt. So farmers worked hard to get oxen that were compatible so they could be equally yoked. They had one goal: they could stay focused and on that straight line and support one another. Equally yoked doesn't mean that you have to be a religious bigot, because that's sometimes what I hear is like, well, okay, so I'm not supposed to interact with non-Christians at all? Like, what's going on? And that's when you have to understand the Bible with the Bible. Paul, when he's writing in the Bible, says we should be in the world, not of the world. We should be all things to all people so that we might win some to Christ. There's this expectation that we interact with non-Christians. I mean, Jesus ate with sinners, walked with sinners, was friends with sinners, and so should we. But that's different than being yoked with them, than being partnered with them, than working to enter into a covenant with them. I think the Message translation, which is really more of like a devotion interpretation of the Bible, of 2 Corinthians 6:14, here's how the Message translates it. They say, don't become partners with those who reject God. Okay, you can be friends with them, you can interact, but don't become partners with them. It goes on to say, how can you make a partnership out of right and wrong? That's not a partnership, that's war. That's war. Oh, he's cute, yeah, she makes good money, she smells good, he's super good looking, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter if you're not equally yoked. Because then the Bible, which speaks truth through generations and generations and generations, the Bible tells you if you choose to be unequally yoked, if you choose to partner your life with someone who rejects God, that's not partnership. That's not marriage. That's not a relationship goal. What is it? It's war. It's going to be war. Intentional dating. If that's where you're at, establish boundaries that bring glory and honor to God, and communicate those boundaries with people who give you feedback, and specifically communicate those boundaries with people you're dating. Just try it. Just try it, and I think it will be a really revealing conversation, either in a good way or a bad way. And if you're dating, be intentional with how you're dating by making sure you're dating someone going the same direction as you. Make sure you're dating someone who doesn't have to be perfect, but is making progress towards living for Jesus Christ and following them. Okay, so now it's time to talk to our married couples. So again, if you're dating, you don't just, okay, well my part's done, I can shut it off now. Keep watching, keep listening, keep taking notes, because there's some really important stuff here, whether you're married or not married. But I want to talk specifically to our married couples. Our relationship goal, remember our first two, seek God first and have a covenant, not a contract. Our relationship goal for this week is to be intentionally married. Does that sound very familiar to the dating aspect? Yes, hopefully it does. Hopefully you connect those dots. It should be familiar. Be intentionally married. Live a united mission together. Think about it. In your marriage, what are you really striving for? Are you just constantly striving for that feeling of acceptance, of romantic love? Maybe you're just striving for comfort. Maybe you're just striving for your own self-interest. What we should be striving for in our marriages is this idea, this goal of glorifying God. Let people see a glimpse of God and His love through the way that you unconditionally commit to your spouse. Through the way that you love and talk about your spouse, through the way that you forgive your spouse, through the way that you show unity together. Let your marriage, which involves God, be a glimpse, be a portrait of God and His love for us. So what is your mission? How are you going to be married intentionally? Be united as one. Have a common mission. There's two things that always unite people: a common enemy and a common mission. Our common enemy is the devil. And that's something I tell people a lot in marriage counseling. Your enemy is not your spouse. Your enemy is not your coworkers. It's not the world. Your enemy is not your kids or your in-laws or anything like that. Your enemy is the devil, and he wants to divide you and destroy you. And I've seen that more and more and more over marriages, where the enemy seeks for just a little bit of a fracture, where he can seep in, he can overwhelm, and he can divide and conquer you. So understand you have a common enemy with your spouse. And it's not your spouse, it's not your kids, it's the devil. And understand you should have a common mission with your spouse. See, I see a lot of couples who don't understand who their enemy is, and they have no idea what their mission as a family is. What do you both hate? Hopefully sin and the devil. What do you both love? Hopefully, if you were intentional about dating, you both love God. And you've been equally yoked, and you're striving for the same thing. But I would challenge you to take that to like the next level. Be specific. What do you both love? I know for Jill and I, we both love students, kids, teenagers. We both love kids, and we have united our lives and our energy and our passion in reaching that generation. Whether Jill's serving in kids ministry, whether I'm teaching youth group, or we're coaching, or we're driving school bus, or we're working at a school, or we're licensed foster parents, we have united in our mission to love God, and that has kind of shown its way through in the way that we want to love students. We want to love kids. If you're watching this, we want to love any student in your life because we think that generation is so pivotal. And so we've united in that cause under this umbrella of loving God. Amos 3:3 says, "Do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so?" So if you're married, live intentionally. Make sure you're moving the same direction as your spouse. I think a lot of times people think they're equally yoked, and then what happens is they start walking different directions. They were equally yoked maybe, but they're going in different directions. Think of it this way. And I'm not the first person to use this analogy, and I certainly won't be the last, but they say that an ideal marriage is like a triangle. It's like a triangle with God at the top and you and your spouse at the bottom. In an ideal marriage, the closer you become to God and the closer your spouse comes to God, the closer you come together. That's why our first goal was seek God first. And that's why there's going to be some variation of this concept in every message of series, because it holds a biblical truth that's unprecedented, that's unchallenged. This works. If you and your spouse are both seeking God first, you will be strengthened in your marriage. I will personally guarantee, it's a money back guarantee. Try it. Just try it and see what happens. But a few things I want you to notice about this. This triangle, it's not a pulley system, right? Like, so if I'm here, I can't force my spouse to get closer to God, right? Honestly, my movement of getting closer to God isn't determined on my spouse's movement. We don't have to match speeds. We just have to be moving in the same direction. We just have to be moving together towards the same common goal. And understand, it's a lifelong process. But what I see a lot of is I see a lot of broken triangles. I see maybe someone who's married and has a relationship with God, but their spouse doesn't. And so their spouse may try to connect with them, but if they are moving towards God, it's going to feel like you're moving away from each other. And so this person will get so frustrated and say, why do I keep trying to get closer to you and I feel like you're moving away from me? It's because you're aiming for different things. I see a lot of broken triangles that look just like this. God is not involved. And so then what we have is we have this person moving part of the way, and they're like, well, hey, I moved here. Why haven't you met me here? Let's meet in the middle. Oh, well, you're only going to go this far. Well, then I'm only going that far. What does that sound like? That sounds like a contract, doesn't it? That's why the ideal marriage is a triangle. You move closer to God, you will move closer together. It's inevitable. Understand, it's a lifelong process. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You're there to help each other, to support each other, but you can't do it for your spouse. But you can just make sure you're aiming towards that same goal. See, God has this plan of oneness in His marriage. He has a plan of oneness in His marriage. What it looks like is it's one God, one man, one female, one marriage. One sexual partner for the rest of your life. One flesh. They become one. What it looks like is one lifetime to fulfill one mission. An intentional marriage is about fulfilling that mission together. So what are you living for? Don't give me the easy, like, oh, this is what I'm living for. What does your time say you're living for? The way you spend your money, what does it say you're living for? What about the way you talk? What about the way you think? What about the way you spend your downtime? What are you living for? The way you interact with your spouse. What are you living for? You know, I started off with that rhyme, and I remember hearing that at Wigan Street as a kid. You know, Andy and so-and-so sitting in a tree. Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes so-and-so pushing a baby carriage. Right? And we think like, okay, well that actually kind of makes sense. Like, you fall in love, you get married, and you have a kid. But let me tell you, that type of love that you fall in before you're married is really not the same type of love after you've been married and living with an intentional purpose. When you enter into a covenant together, the type of love you develop supersedes any idea of that romantic love that you may have experienced earlier. Right? Just like think about your relationship with God. The way that you love Him now is probably deeper and stronger and more committed than the way when you first entered into that covenant with God. Right? Your love has grown. The way you thought you loved God before versus the way you love God now has changed. If you're united in a mission with your spouse, the way you love your spouse now versus the way you thought you did right before you were married has changed and it has grown. I would challenge you that if you're like, you know what, Andy, it hasn't. My love hasn't grown. My love hasn't changed. I don't feel better about my love with my spouse now than I did then let me step on your toes a little bit and let me challenge you. And let me say, there's probably something wrong with your triangle. There's a break in there's an incomplete triangle somehow. Seek God first. Seek unconditional commitment. And live for a mission. Make sure you're pointed in the same direction with your spouse. And if you're not, stop everything else until you do that. It's that important. Be united and live with a common mission. Don't let the enemy divide and destroy. Live with unity, live with a common purpose, be intentionally married, and make sure you're walking together in the same direction. I love you, church.